The title we gave this was Why Journalism Matters. Mm-hmm. Why does journalism matter?
Well, journalism matters because it's, I think, and I was about to say ideally, but practically too, embodied in journalism are basic freedoms. Yeah. Freedom of speech, freedom, the right to know, all the basic democratic freedoms that seem often so abstract are really within journalism, because that old truism that information is power is underpinning journalism. And that without that power, without that information that journalists should deliver to their readers, viewers and listeners, there can be no participation which we call democracy. I think it's as basic as that. So that's not the way it's practiced.
I was going to say that. Elaborate.
You've just had a little bit of utopia.
Yes. It's nice to start with.
It is. Let's get down to the real stuff. No, I believe that is absolutely correct, and that's always...
But that has been the drive.
I feel very passionate about it.
Yes, that's driven you, hasn't it? That's why it's important.
Yeah. Yes, it has. I mean, I've always had a sense that people, ordinary people, like most of us, have that right to a diversity of information. They have a right to those of us who say that our job is to keep the record straight. They have a right that we do our job. They have a right that we remain skeptical of those who wish to control the lives of people, that we are not part of an established order. Of course we all are, but that we strive as best we can to be independent. They have that right. And I believe that, you know, we are truly agents of people. Whereas I think most of journalism, so-called mainstream journalism, and I challenge that very description of it, are agents of power, are agents of an established order.
You question the definition of mainstream?
Yes.
Go for it. What
well, I think those whose journalism is meant for most people are the mainstream. And I think these days, the mainstream, well, for a very long time, is corporate, is a word I think that probably describes it. It is corporate. It represents a corporate world. It doesn't represent the rich diversity, the spectrum of those who read newspapers, who listen to radio, who watch television. I think it represents vested interests and marks invisible boundaries of how far the debate and discussion and the news gathering, the objectivity, all the rest of it, how far it should go. And you have this almost institutionalized in a very powerful organization like the BBC. And I think it's a shame that the BBC is always attacked from the usual suspects, by the usual suspects, but there isn't any really critical public examination of news and current affairs as it's disseminated by the BBC from the other side.
So how would you like to see the BBC evolve? Obviously, the BBC is very popular. You know,
Yeah.
people
Well,
vote, say that they have enormous trust in the
Yeah.
BBC and all that. So it's clearly won the support of a large number of people in this
Yeah.
country. How would you see
well,
changes in the BBC?
I agree with I agree with the institution of the BBC, that it should be an institution. I think it is long overdue for being the elite that runs it. I don't think represents the people that put their faith in the BBC. The idea that you have a whole raft of people, including the Director General, getting £600,000 of public money every year is absurd.
So more,
That's a corrupting factor.
so more democracy in the election of the
Yeah.
governors.
Well,
Is that what you'd
no,
like?
no, you have to turn around. There aren't any governors anymore. They call them now trustees.
Trustees, okay.
You know, and when the BBC got a bit close to the truth in the run-up to the Iraq War, they fired the Director General and the Gavin Davies'
Yeah.
job, I've forgotten his name, whatever it was, and of course the reporter had told the truth.
Yes.
So I think this is, I'm going to concentrate as such on the BBC, except the BBC is unique and uniquely powerful, and it does enjoy that trust, not entirely because of its news and current affairs. I love the BBC,
Right.
of a lot of the programmes that it does. I find watching news on the BBC or ITN or on anything almost painful now, because I'm forever deconstructing it, monitoring it. I'm not being informed by it.
Right.
Now, I think there is a debate to be had about what is news and where the sources of news should come from, and where the let's say the architecture of current affairs, where it should come from. You know,
When you made your comments about the right of the public to good journalism, some people argue that the public have a right themselves to journalism. You know, it's this debate around
Yeah.
citizen journalism. How do you slot into that debate?
yeah, I think sure they do. Without cancelling out everybody's academic career, I think that you can be a journalist.
Yeah. But this is threatening professional journalists,
simply,
isn't it?
in many ways.
If everyone is a journalist, then
Well,
where does this
No, I don't agree that everyone should be a journalist, just like saying everyone who
has a
can
right?
work a little camera can be a filmmaker.
Right.
Has a right? No, I don't think everyone has a right. You know, you could say you could be a right to be any kind of a craftsman or a professional. You don't have that right until you earn that right, I think. I think
Okay.
you do have rights to produce information. Whether that right then dissolves into something else as you try to get it published is one thing. But, I mean, we have, for example, during the Iraq occupation, the role of, if you like, citizen journalists in reporting Iraq. They have done the best job. You have two of the best, Dar Jamal, who completely unembedded
Yes.
independent journalist, an American, who reported the assault on Fallujah, and from the other side of the conflict, you had people like
Felicity.
Joe Wilding,
Felicity.
who was and Felicity Arbuthnot. These and from the mainstream, Terry Lloyd, who was murdered, an ITN reporter, unembedded, a very courageous reporter who drove into Iraq during the invasion and was shot dead because he wasn't embedded. And, you know, journalism always has been best served, and perhaps this is true of many things, but it's certainly true of journalism, by the honourable exceptions.
Yes. Can I just pick up that point? Are you saying that journalists during the invasion were deliberately is the word, attacked by the military?
Well, according to the coroner, yes, who presided over Terry Lloyd's post-mortem. He was wounded, and then he was shot by the US Marines as he was carried into the back of a thing. And the numbers of people who were... Iraq has seen more journalists murdered and deliberately targeted than any other war in history.
Yes. 17 were killed actually during the invasion, weren't there, which is unprecedented.
Yeah. I mean...
You feel that this is a deliberate... Why would the military want to do that?
Well, because there's been a change. You know, the unembedded journalist, the independent journalist, a war reporter, is regarded as a threat, and rightly so, because he or she is likely to tell the truth.
But they're working...
And militaries are rather ruthless organisations. They don't give a damn. They look what happened to Al Jazeera's people in Afghanistan and Iraq. Al Jazeera went right against the grain and had reporters actually telling the truth here and there. Bang! All of a sudden, they bombed them and killed them.
But these journalists have been killed, are working for mainstream corporate media, who maybe, according to your argument, are propagandists for the state. How do you account for this? There's a contradiction, a paradox there. They're killing these journalists who, you might argue, are propagandists. No? What's going on there?
I think that any journalist these days who takes the very grave decision and risk to abandon the whole embedding system, which is now part of fighting wars. It's called in the jargon information dominance, and you only achieve information dominance if you have all the media corralled within your control as much as it can be. Any journalist who strays outside that in a dangerous area is in grave danger of two things: of being killed, and two, finding out what's going on. And it's whether he or she finds out what's going on first is the thing that exercises militaries. But then, you know, militaries are very ruthless organisations, and they've become more so. They used when I covered wars, particularly in Vietnam, we actually used to write on our front press in Vietnamese and in English. Well, that'd be like putting a target, a bullseye on that. I'm not kidding.
Yeah. I know that you have great admiration for Chomsky's propaganda model. Is that correct?
Well, I'm sure about great admiration. I think it is a useful way of analysing it. I see there's a lot of common sense in it.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think I'd leave it to you to describe the propaganda model and the filtering and so on.
Sure.
But I think there's just a lot of common sense, really, that journalists are... I mean, what he and Herman were saying in that is that journalists are subjected to a kind of subliminal seduction. They often don't know that they are producing propaganda, or at least a very narrow version of the news. It's not even self-censorship. It's a kind of subliminal understanding that this is the way the system works. That happens in universities, it happens in all institutions. When the institution is very sophisticated, as broadcasting institutions are, and has its own mythologies, you know, of objectivity and impartiality and all that, then it can be very, very effective. And what they're saying, basically, is there is a filter. And journalists play the role of filtering the news, the word of authority, great power, vested interests, in a way that is acceptable to those sources, to the public. I think that's been my experience.
That's a very strong argument, of course, but people say that where is the individual journalist in all that? There are all these enormous historic, cultural, political, economic forces impacting on journalists. How do you actually theorise your position? You're critical of the mainstream corporate working within it, Robert Fisk, Peter Wilby, Philip Knightley, George Monbiot, etc. How would you theorise these people who are clearly quite critical of the corporate media, but are operating within it?
You ran out of names there, Richard.
Yes.
Any others?
Germaine Greer, sort of. How do you theorise? How do you theorise them?
Look, they're all honourable exceptions.
Okay.
And you know, Fisk is a great reporter, but you know, he also keeps the idea of, you know, romantic idea of
professional responsibility.
But Fisk and I sat down once in New York. We went to a conference like this at Columbia University, and we rather upset them because we went through that day's New York Times, and we proved something that we'd said jointly, that 90% at least of the sources of the daily news in a mainstream newspaper, broadcasting institution, come from official or semi-official sources, both domestic and foreign policy. All right, you weed out the lighter stories and so on, but the foreign policy. We picked up the New York Times and went through it, and we found one that wasn't.
Right. And
that's where the sources of information come from. And my argument, and Bob Fisk's, and Knightley's, and would I think, broadly speaking, they would agree. But there aren't. I think when people are within institutions, I mean, all of us have been within institutions, so we've done our apprenticeship of finding this out, if you like. It's I can say it because I've got nothing to lose, really. I've been around for a while, and I've done the work, and I've made the films and so on. But I think it's important for young journalists to understand that, and a skepticism, a considered skepticism, is very, very important. Not of people.
Right. A
lot of young journalists believe, no, I won't say a lot, some believe that a sort of skepticism about people, that they won't like it, almost preordains them as journalists. So it's a ready-made cynicism. When in fact there should be a skepticism about power in all its forms right from the beginning. It's only when you have that do you produce independent journalism, in my view.
Okay. One of the critiques, we spoke about this earlier, of the Chomsky theory is that it actually marginalises the importance of deliberate manipulation of the media by the intelligence, the spooks. Do you go with that line? Has that been your experience? How much influence do they have?
I mean, look, I don't want to change your question, but look, Noam Chomsky's wonderful contribution is his deconstruction of journalism and of news and of power. I'm not sure I go 100% with some of the theories. I know what you're saying, that he, for instance, he stands back. He's very conservative, and indeed about all the theories around 9/11.
Yes.
I haven't discussed that with him, and I probably will. I'm seeing him next year, and I will ask him about that, because I know that he gets an avalanche. I get a small avalanche, he gets a real avalanche of stuff about 9/11 and people wanting us to question it. I don't do it because I haven't done enough work on it. I think it should be questioned. I think the Keane report, the official report on 9/11 itself, is a bit like the Warren report on the assassination of John Kennedy. I mean, no one believes it. Not even the people on it believe it.
No.
So, but whether it then strays into all those stories and theories that are very much alive on the internet is another thing altogether. Chomsky, I think, has decided to that's a major distraction from really understanding how power works. And I think I can. He would put it differently, I'm sure, but that's my reading of it. Yes.
Okay. You began articulating the ideas which inspired you to be a journalist.
Yeah.
Which particular individual journalists have inspired you, John?
Well,
I.F. Stone?
Yes.
Wilfred Burchard?
Yes. Wilfred Burchard, certainly. Wilfred Burchard probably had the scoop of the 20th century, and I have his front page on my study wall. And it's a very good story. It's about a journalist going his own way. He was the Asian correspondent of the Daily Express during World War II.
He was.
Yeah, and he actually was embedded, I didn't use the word then, you had to be, with the US Navy and the US Marines, and had landed with them a lot in the Pacific and so on. Anyway, he ended up in Japan after the right at the end of the war, and classically shows nothing has changed. All the occupation forces, General MacArthur and the rest, got all the media, all the journalists together to go to this great ceremony on board USS Missouri, at which General MacArthur, resplendent, would take the surrender from the bowing Japanese imperial leadership. And this would be, and there are famous photographs of it, this was a great set piece, end of the war and so on, undoubtedly a very important thing, but it was a set piece. One journalist said, I don't like this, there's something else. The atomic bombs had been dropped. Incredibly, the atomic bombs were not then reported as bombs of radiation. They were reported as causing a fantastic blast and certainly levelling cities. But that wasn't unusual, of course, as most of Europe had been levelled. Tokyo had already been levelled. So Burchard set out on this perilous journey to Hiroshima. And Japan was a very angry country, very sullen country, defeated. And he describes in darkened railway carriages with still armed soldiers around him. And indeed, when he finally reached Hiroshima, he was arrested by the Japanese secret police, briefly put in prison. Anyway, to cut it short, he went into the hospitals. He saw this thing which he called an atomic plague. He saw people dying with spots of them, burns, all the things that we now know was the result of radiation. And he got this to his newspaper via Morse code, to a correspondent in Tokyo who passed it on, and it started with,
famously,
I write this as a warning to the world.
Yes, my warning to the world.
My warning to the world. And the Express in those days was actually a real newspaper. It was a broadsheet. And they did the worst. This is typically journalism. A sub-editor got his name wrong. They had Peter Burchett.
Wilfred.
Instead of Wilfred. Which Wilfred, I knew him very well, took very generously.
Australian?
Yes, he's Australian. Many of the correspondents, like Moorhead and Chester Wilmot, were Australians in the Second World War. The point about, but the real point of this is a very romantic and good story. On his way back, incidentally, he was adding to the story. Wilfred did carry a great Colt 45 on his hip on the way back. He kept it. He picked it up somewhere in Hiroshima and decided to liberate a couple of POW camps, which he wrote about. But the point about this story was that he had really blown the whistle on the atomic age, and all hell broke loose for him. They took away his credentials. They were about to throw him out of Japan. The New York Times ran a front-page story saying that this was all a lie, that Burchett was a propagandist. He was shunned by a lot of his colleagues, but of course he was vindicated within, took a while, a month or two, when journalists finally reached Hiroshima as a pack. So for me, it's the model of a journalist using his initiative, using his sense that some great act had been committed here and that a lot of people had suffered, that their stories needed to be told, and he did tell their stories, individual stories and so on, and he needed, in other words, to make sense of this extraordinary event, the beginning of the nuclear age, which he did.
You have to be very courageous to be a journalist as well.
Well, you certainly had to be courageous doing what he did.
Yeah. But even now? Even now?
I don't think physical bravery is not necessary. No. That's the...
But speaking globally, I mean in countries like Colombia and wherever...
Yes. I'm speaking...
The fate of journalists globally...
There are two kinds of journalists here. There are those of us who operate in free societies and whose doors are not going to be kicked down and shot in the middle of the night, not yet. There are those who don't, as in the Philippines, which has the highest number of journalist deaths in the world.
Yes, indeed.
Where journalists, some extraordinarily courageous journalists, challenge the state, challenge local corruption, and so on and so forth, are murdered. This has happened in Turkey, it's happened on Suharto in Indonesia, and so on. It doesn't happen in our societies, and I think and you don't have to go to Baghdad, you don't have to go to Afghanistan. I think reporting the way power presents itself, reporting what the hidden agendas of governments are, what the real foreign policies might be, of demonstrating that skepticism that I spoke about, can be done here. Now, if that requires courage, okay, maybe. I think it requires being a journalist.
Okay. We're coming to an end, John. It's gone quickly, but maybe tell the folk, you're here for a particular reason today. Yes. Can you maybe tell what's been going on today?
Yes, I'm here because as some of you will know, I came up, was it 4 or 5 years ago? Was it
5 years?
5 years ago, to open the School of Journalism, and I've remained very closely in touch with Richard and with John Pilger, and generally kept an eye on the way, I suppose, journalism is taught and presented at Lincoln. And it occurred to me at the beginning of the year that this Lincoln University would be the right home for my archive of journalism, and indeed the right home for my website, which is read all around the world, to be developed and improved and enhanced generally. So I approached John and Richard about this, and this has been taken up very enthusiastically by everybody, including Mike Sachs and others at the university, and I'm hoping that the outcome will be both a website of journalism, immediate journalism, and also a research resource for students, for you people, for people in the future, for others, that will span the number of films and all the work I've done in journalism. So in other words, I'm becoming very closely associated with Lincoln, and I'm very pleased about that.
Well, we too are very thrilled, John. I had 14 headings that I wanted to discuss.
Yeah, I knew you wouldn't.
I've covered 2, but that's enough of me. It's over to you. Can you put your hand up, say who you are, and I will invite you to ask your question or put a comment. Yes, first one.
Ian Bagley, Professor of Mental Health here at the University. Given what you've said over the last half hour and what Chomsky said about the 5 filters model, is it possible to have a free press? Or are we talking about degrees of control?
No, it's not possible to have a free press in a corporate system. And I don't believe we have one in the so-called corporate system. No. I think the press, journalism, is only free when it's independent as it can be. And this, in the present system, conspires against independence. That's not to say, and I emphasize this, that's not to say that there are not parts of the media and people in the media that produce extraordinary work and different work. It's, you know, those Richard mentioned have navigated through the system, as I have. And, you know, I've spent most of my life working hard to stay within the so-called mainstream because that's where the audiences are. I've never seen any point in exiling myself into the so-called margins. I'm not so sure now because I think the margins have actually been taken over by the World Wide Web. And I think the very notion of the mainstream is being seriously challenged by the publication that Richard and John have just produced. I've written the foreword for about, for instance, peace journalism. It's not a label that I like particularly, I have to say, but compared with the war journalism that is the majority of the mainstream, it's admirable. So I'm not even sure that that book and all the people who have contributed to it would have happened. Their work would have happened some years ago. So things are changing.
Yes.
Hiya, I'm Lee Milner. In relation to that question as well, you say in your book Tell Me No Lies, you say that giant public relation companies have a huge effect on the editorial content. And we haven't really got a free press. What's going to happen to the future of investigative journalism? Is there going to be investigative journalism in the future, or aspiring journalists?
Well, is there going to be investigative journalism? I mean, investigative journalism, the term didn't exist when I didn't exist for quite a long time, really. I think it started in the mid-70s with Watergate. All journalism should be investigative. And that's one of the problems, that it's become a kind of a commentary, which also has its place in journalism, but it's taken over most of journalism, whereas inquiry journalism, the who, what, where, when and why journalism, the investigative journalism, if you like, has become rather exotic. It probably always has been. There are, in the United States now, there are universities which promote investigative units of investigative journalism. There's, for instance, in Washington, a group called the Center for Public Integrity, which has done some extraordinary investigative journalism. In other words, it's sort of looking for a home always, looking for backers, looking for an outlet. One of the great investigative journalists in the United States, Seymour Hersh, one of his great exposés was the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, which contributed, the disclosure of which contributed to the beginning of the end of the war in Vietnam. He didn't go to Vietnam. He spent months crisscrossing the country, interviewing everybody he could find who was even remotely involved with that episode. And when he had his story, he couldn't find anybody who would publish it. So he put it out on a very small, so-called alternative news service called Dispatch News Service, which is still small and still quite alternative. But it caught fire after a while. So it's not easy. If you want to be an investigative journalist, you can't be Woodward or Bernstein. There are a lot of better ones, I think, anyway, with all respect to that illustrious pair. You're almost certainly not going to be backed by a great newspaper. You're going to have to go into the cold. But what you'll have is your passion for wanting to do it.
They were essentially pawns of the FBI, weren't they? But we'll move on from that. Woodward and Bernstein. That's another discussion. Yeah, absolutely, comrade.
He's got it.
John, you mentioned the role of the mainstream media in confining the public debate to certain restricted parameters. And if one looks at the debates at recent party conferences and the media coverage that they enjoyed, journalists were almost unanimous in supporting the idea that there needs to be massive cuts in public services. Now, the PCS union is currently consulting its members about whether to support independent trade union candidates in elections. And this is a reaction to the convergence of politics in Britain towards support for big business, war, inequality and so on.
Yeah.
Can the general corporate consensus in the media be challenged by reform of the media in isolation? Or do you think it could also require a political challenge to the corporate consensus?
Well, yeah, of course. It's going to require political challenge, and you're absolutely right. Isn't it fantastic? Isn't it fantastic that the major story now is what they call a fire sale of public assets in this country because a load of banks basically and their dodgy hedge funds on both sides of the Atlantic stole a great deal of money and have been given much of that money back by the government.
Mm.
The way that, I think it's almost a model, the way that the agenda has been shifted on both sides of the Atlantic, from the banks, from Wall Street, from the city, from the Royal Bank of Scotland, from these excesses, I like that word, that caused the trouble in the first place, from the subprime mortgage scandal that ripped off ordinary people across the United States. It's been shifted from this over to cutting the hell out of our public services. Now that, it's almost a model, unfortunate model exercise of the media presenting the agenda of what I would call vested interest entirely. And I have to say that trade unions don't help. When they go along to Labour Party conference and make a bit of noise, but no, but it's true, isn't it? You know, that being part of a ritualistic exercise which ends up anointing this idea that public services have to be sold off. It's almost as if we're back in 1980 or something, at the beginning of the Thatcher period. But we, unlike then, the public actually know what happened, and yet there are no windfall taxes on the banks. Nothing like this is proposed or allowed to be discussed within the media. And it's worthy of, I think it's a very vivid demonstration of how an agenda is shifted from the broad truth to an agenda of vested interests.
Yes.
Thank you for the explanation. You have pointed out that the key task for the journalist is to filter the truth. My question is, what constitutes truth in the eye of the journalist? As you know, that so many decisions is taken closed door.
I missed the very last bit. What is the truth in the eye of the journalist?
Yeah.
What is the truth?
Yeah. Okay.
Well, there are many truths. I don't think there's one truth. We'd leave that to religions to suggest that there is one truth. There are many truths. There are demonstrable facts. There is a great deal of evidence. It is about putting the pieces in a big jigsaw. So you may get 50% of the truth, 75% if you're lucky, very lucky. But as any whistleblower will tell you, and that's where real truth comes from, whistleblowers within government, and where real courage is demonstrated, I believe, is they say that even the investigative journalists get, I think it was Catherine Gunn, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office whistleblower on the Iraq wars, who talked about 5%. You get 5% of the truth. So, in other words, the truth is very elusive, and that I believe that all a journalist can aspire to do is to truthfully try to find out. So truthfully finding out becomes the aim, not necessarily finding the whole truth. That's not possible.
Truth is elusive, but politicians definitely lie, don't they?
Yeah.
Right, we're agreed.
That's the truth.
That's true. Yes.
The corporate press can help to report on deaths of soldiers in Afghanistan. Does this duty to speak for the soldiers in a way restrict the extent to which the press can then criticise, interrogate the conflict? And how do we balance commemoration and interrogation?
Yeah, I mean, soldiers have always been used, their suffering and their deaths, and the spectacle of their of the commemoration of their deaths have always been used. There's a very, and used cynically. One example is the use of the Wiltshire town of Wootton Bassett, through which flag-wrapped coffins of often 18-year-olds, who shouldn't, 18-year-olds up at the front, like the First World War, and are given this kind of patriotic ritual in which one is almost intimidated from suggesting that why they died. Except now and then a parent, very courageous parent, like Mr. Brearley the other day, who refused to shake Blair's hand, or the Gentle family, will break through that. That propaganda is the propaganda of honouring the sacrifice of young people in a war, confused with the sheer wrongness and the lies around that war. That has been always a very powerful propaganda. On the BBC recently, there was an extremely painful to watch documentary called Wounded. It's about two young lads who'd lost limbs, one was blinded. Shocking. At no point in that documentary was there any suggestion yes, I mean, of course there was a suggestion of waste. It was a waste of young lives. That was obvious. But that this need not have happened to them and need not happen to others was not suggested. And I see one of the film reviewers in The Guardian, I read TV reviewers, congratulated the Ministry of Defence for allowing such a frank film. He missed the point. He missed the point. The Ministry of Defence would have pushed that film because it's confusing. I don't believe it's succeeding, by the way, because the majority of the people in this country, if the polls are to be believed, and they're fairly repetitive on this, are opposed to this colonial war in Afghanistan. But the propaganda, that propaganda hasn't changed. That's been like that since for the last couple of 100 years. Yeah.
Filtered out of the system as well. I mean, besides like you or Robert or other examples. So what kind of advice do you have to young journalists or students who would like to start a career? Do you have any advice? Should we go into the mainstream and try to navigate through, or should we try other ways?
No, I would suggest you try to navigate through. I don't altogether agree with Herman and Chomsky that everyone is marginalised. No. Otherwise I wouldn't be sitting here tonight. But it's an effort. And you have to be guided by a determination that has to be fairly strong, really, of what you want to do and the way you want your work to be presented. And that's what I would call navigation. It's a difficult route, and especially today, but it can happen. And I think it's about whether you have the will to have a go at it or not. there is a whole spectrum of places to go to. There's, of course, still the internet, but there are within the mainstream there is still the respect for the great journalistic story. Not always, but there still is. And I've often advised young people to take them off somewhere where they can get hold of that story. So they're not simply turning up saying, "Get a job." They're turning up with a piece of their journalism that the other side might want very much. That's not always easy, but none of it is easy. And so I would suggest navigation. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm John Pilger, Professor of Law. My faculty is about to move into the building that was occupied by the Lincolnshire Echo, which is downsizing. It's clearly a symptom of what's happening to the regional press in that case. But
Yeah.
you also hear stories about, say, the Guardian and other parts of the press beginning to worry about whether they're going to be available. Is the internet capable of presenting a business model where people can actually get jobs, produce work, and people like me will get used to the idea of downloading from the internet and reading my news there, and hopefully having less corporate power. Will the ISP, will Yahoo and all the rest just simply control it in the same way that News Corp does?
Yeah, I mean, my own journalism habits have changed radically. I log on and download first things. I never thought I'd hear myself saying such awful words. Sounds like some sort of martial art. I do, because I know where to go. There are so many now good sites, even though it's only a minority on the web. Most of the web is actually corporate control, as you know. But there is a sizable minority of websites that fall across the world, and if you keep a skeptical eye on them, you can produce. So that's my habit.
Which do you log on to, John? Which websites would you recommend?
Well, there is a whole list of them on my website. It's probably hard to find. But I think one of the best trawls. Some of these are very modest outfits. There's one you'll know, International Clearing House, run by a young man in California who must work, never sleep. He produces a digest, actually, of the mainstream and the non-mainstream, both in print and in television and in radio. It's extraordinary. And every day, under International Clearing House, will come about 15 major stories that, frankly, shame The Guardian, for instance, because I'll then go and look at The Guardian, and I will have printed out. It may be even from the Los Angeles Times, Guardian-type papers, but not a lot. It will go to Al Jazeera, it will go to Latin American sources, and so on. So, as a basic news source, it's excellent. The problem with net's hard to make a career on the net because no one pays for anything. They just simply pirate it. Every film I've made is all over the net, and I haven't had a penny from it. I'm not bothered by that. I'm delighted that so many people are looking at them. But it's a bit difficult when you're trying to support a mortgage and a family and so on. I think it's possible what you're suggesting, but I would personally prefer to keep a very strong foothold on planet Earth as well as in cyberspace. I think the two go together. If you can work the two of them, then you can. I mean, undoubtedly the best reporting, the best war reporting, as we've already discussed, has been on the net. Reporters like the American Nir Rosen, I mentioned Dar Jamal, these people have put their work finally into books, but their day-to-day reporting has been on the net. And I think they're meeting a need. They're meeting a need. I think people love newspapers. I think people like the television news. They like the whole idea of current affairs. I think they particularly like newspapers. I mean, when 9/11 happened, what was instructive about that was that practically every newspaper sold out, even though the thing was running as this horrific spectacle on television. There's something about newspapers. People will go. In that case, it worked for a lot of people. I think generally speaking, people no longer trust many newspapers. So the net meets the need of what is missing from the Planet Earth media.
John, I'm going to call that a day because I like finishing on time. You spoke about logging on. Well, folks, we have here the link. The excellent newspaper, the people in the university will know this. I wish to congratulate them that they've been put up for an award, a Guardian Award. There will be parts of this, they're filming it, so if you want to log on to the.co.uk, you will find excerpts of what has been a fascinating discussion. Obviously I only covered a few, we've only covered a few. This could run and run, really, because we all want to hear John Pilger. But thanks so much for coming, and let's show our appreciation.